A group of Tyler residents says that they're coming together to try to improve North Tyler while preserving its history. Tonight was their first meeting.
KLTV7's Alex Weister was there. He spoke with some of you who have come together to voice some concerns and how you want to see the north side of the city look going forward.
Right now, they ain't taking us serious.
Tyler residents and business owners are joining together to help change North Tyler.
For us, it was very interesting, yes.
It was refreshing to know other people care.
Yes.
Yeah.
Marcy and Roderick Lee have lived in North Tyler their whole lives. They came to the meeting raising concerns about the cleanliness of the area, as well as wanting to see more youth programs.
So I believe if there are more programs that the children can attend and the parents as well, then we can get everyone involved. And then we can make sure that the community is clean.
The Empowerment Community Development Corporation held the first ever meeting for the North Tyler First Coalition, which is aiming to bring business owners and residents like the Lees together to help clean, rebuild, and beautify North Tyler. The coalition would consist of 5 different groups to help different aspects of the area.
In the next 5 years, God's willing, we're going to see a different looking North Tyler.
Stanley Kofert, the president of Empowerment CDC, says that with the input of the group, they hope to engage the community and fix issues with grants or donations or bring awareness to the city.
That is exciting to me, you know, that people are just not talking about it. They really want to see something done. And the passion that many of them showed tonight is extraordinary.
The group says it will take time to work on different areas, but it's important to start planning and working now, not later.
We don't have to mumble and grumble about it all the time. We can actually use this already established platform to kind of get some things in motion now. So if you're serious about making a change over in North Tyler, then here it is.
Alex Weister, KLTV7 News.
The coalition will have meetings every second Tuesday of the month at the Texas African American Museum in North Tyler.